Hello and welcome to Theology Thursday. When we read the Bible, particularly a couple of places in the Old Testament, boy, a lot of questions just immediately start popping in our mind. And so I want to consider one particular passage today and talk about some of the weird laws or some of the bizarre regulations that we find in the Old Testament, and why are they even there? Do they apply today? How do we understand them? And so I want us to look in the book of Leviticus at chapter 19. And there are other places in Scripture that have these, but I wanted to look particularly at Leviticus 19 because it seems to have more of them than anywhere else. So Leviticus chapter 19, starting in verse 19, reads this way: "You will keep my statutes. You will not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You will not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material. If a man lies sexually with a woman who is a slave assigned to another man and not yet ransomed or given her freedom, a distinction shall be made. They will not be put to death because she was not free. But he shall bring his compensation to the Lord, to the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram for a guilt offering. The priest will make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord for his sin that he has committed, and he shall be forgiven for the sin that he has committed. When you come into the land and plant any kind of tree for food, then you will regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it will be forbidden to you. It must not be eaten. And in the 4th year, all its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat of its fruit to increase its yield for you. I am the Lord your God. You will not eat any flesh with the blood in it. You will not interpret omens or tell fortunes. You will not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You will not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land fall into prostitution and the land become full of depravity. You'll keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or necromancers. Do not seek them out and so make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. You will stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. When a stranger sojourns with you in the land, you will do him no wrong. You will treat the stranger who sojourns you as the native among you, and you will love him as yourself. And for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You will do no wrong in judgment, in measures of length or weight or quantity. You will have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You must observe all my statutes, all my rules, and do them. I am the Lord." Wow. Some of these are pretty straightforward and obvious. But some of them really raise questions. You mean I can't plant a field with two kinds of seed? And how strict is that? For example, maybe I want to plant my garden with green beans, but I want some that are on a bush and some that are on a vine, or a couple different variations. Or maybe you want to plant a vineyard and we'll use some different types of grapes. Is it okay as long as they're all grapes, even if they're different types, or can you not even mix the types of grapes? I mean, lots of questions arise, and why are they not allowed to do so? And then the whole garment of mixed material really raises a lot of questions. And then probably the one I get questions about the most is in verse 28, not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord. And so one of the questions I get oftentimes from people is, are tattoos a sin? And this is a verse that they want to ask about, and what does it mean? How do we understand it? So I want to talk about the location of these commands, first of all, because that's really critical. Secondly, I want to talk about the purpose of the commands. And then third, I want to talk about their relevancy for today. So let's talk about their location. The book of Leviticus is a fascinating book. You have a lot of offerings and clean and unclean animals and lots of stuff leading up to Leviticus 16. Leviticus 16 is the Day of Atonement, when breaking of God's law is atoned for by the death of a goat and the blood being sprinkled on the mercy seat on top of the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies. Then Leviticus 17 through the end of the book is what's called the Holiness Code, because there are all these regulations about how you're supposed to live a holy life. And it's in this section that we find, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The word holy, about half the occurrences in the Old Testament occur in these dozen or so chapters. And so there's a lot about holy living in these. So we need to understand that these regulations fall into holy living. They're, for the most part, not really considered moral commands. Some of them are, but mostly they are holy. So what does it mean to be holy? Well, there's a coming Theology Thursday in a few weeks on holiness, and so I'll save a lengthy discussion for there. But in these chapters, the primary idea is you are separated out to the Lord. Notice how many times in here it says, I'm the Lord your God. You're doing this because I'm the Lord your God, not because it's healthy, not because it's morally right thing to do. These are not universal commands to everyone. These are commands to God's people to show that they are separated to Him. As a matter of fact, there's a couple places. Verse 31 says, don't consult to mediums or necromancers, people that supposedly communicate with the dead. Don't go to a seance because you'll become unclean by them. So the clean and unclean is the idea of being able to come into God's presence in the temple or not. It was very ceremonial. It wasn't really a moral issue. It was ceremonial. So if you have skin condition, which all skin conditions are called leprosy, you were supposed to be separated. So there's some other things. You can make lamp oil. You can make incense to help, make your house smell better. We tend to use scenties and scented candles, or people use, the oils or whatever. But they would use incense to make their house smell better. However, there was a particular incense that could only be used in the temple. You couldn't use it. So there's a distinction between being what belongs to God and just what's common. Now, this is important when we come to the mixed fields and particularly the mixed garments. And here's why that is interesting. In Exodus chapter 28, it's repeated again in Exodus 39, but Exodus 28, this is what we read. Then they shall make the ephod of gold. This is talking about what the high priest would wear. A blue, purple, and scarlet yarns, and yarn would have been from wool, and a fine twined linen, which would have been made from flax. So the ephod is going to be made, this outside garment is going to be made of mixed materials. It will have 2 shoulder pieces attached to its 2 edges so that it may be joined together. So that's how they would put it on up here on the shoulders. And the skillful woven band on it shall be made like it and be of one piece with it, of gold, blue, and purple, and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen. So we have yarns, which would have been wool, and linen, which would have been from flax. So God's telling them in Exodus 28 to make mixed garments, and yet in Leviticus 19 he tells them you can't do it. So what's up with that? Well, the high priest didn't wear the ephod all the time, just when he went in to do the duties as a priest. These were, for lack of better description, church clothes, which I always found to be a humorous statement anyway, but these were for when he's doing the duties as a priest is when he would wear it. So here's the idea. You don't wear what the priest wears to go into the temple, to come into the presence of God. That's not for common, everyday, what you wear. This is not really regulation on clothing or the materials that make clothing. This is the mixed garments are holy to the Lord. The incense is holy to the Lord. The priest is holy to the Lord. There are all these requirements to be able to come into the temple. And so you aren't supposed to replicate any of that in your daily life to remind the people, I'm the Lord your God. So that's why they have those regulations. It was about a recognition of the holiness of God. That's what it's teaching. Not, hey, don't wear a 50% cotton shirt. That's irrelevant. But instead, it is to show that distinction of set apart to God. Now we get to another set in here. We're like cutting the edges of the hair and cutting yourself with the dead and tattooing. Those were things that the pagan religions did as a part of their worship and commitment to their God. And so here's what we find. Here's some things pagans did. You don't do them because you belong to me. Here are things that the priest does that belong to the Lord in the temple. You don't do those. So one set of things are seen as holy to the Lord. You don't do those because those are reserved just to remind us of the awesomeness and the holiness and the purity and the exclusivity of God. Then the things that the pagans do, you don't do those because you don't want to be identified with them. So here's what we have. We have basically 3 sets. There's the what I do set. There's the things that belong to the Lord set. And there are things that belong to the pagans set. I avoid the things that belong to pagans because we don't want to be identified as pagans. I don't do the things that belong to the Lord because they are a reminder that God is holy and that to come into his presence requires that I be clean. God's called me as one of his people to live a life of cleanliness. And so all the rest of this is reserved for me right here in my normal everyday life. That's why there's a couple statements in here about observing the Sabbath. That seventh day belongs to the Lord. So you don't do the normal stuff on the Sabbath day. You don't cook, you don't work in your field, those type of things, because it's a reminder we belong to God, and this day belongs to God. Now, you don't eat the fruit off the tree for the first couple of years. That lets the tree grow and mature. And then in the fourth year, it belongs to the Lord, not to me, as a reminder that I believe God will provide, act of faith, and God's holy, and there's his, and there's mine, and I don't want to besmudge what is God. So it's just a constant reminder of the purity that God's people are to have in their life of holiness before the Lord. So that's the context. It sits in that holiness context in the second half of Leviticus. This is what it's dealing with, things that belong to the Lord, things that belong to pagans, and then all the other regular everyday stuff. And so there's supposed to be this distinction to remind us of the holiness of God and the unholiness of the other stuff. So now that then comes down to, how does that then apply to us? Well, here's where it's very important to understand that the Bible speaks in pictures, not in abstract statements. So all these verses can be summarized with, look, you just live your normal life and that's fine. And just live your normal life. But there are some things that are off limits, and that reminds us that we belong to this God who is so holy. So the fact that I don't wear a mixed garment reminds me that I belong to this holy God. And these things I avoid over here, I avoid because I don't want to be identified with the pagans. Like, I have a full commitment to the Lord. It could just say that. There's the daily stuff, the pagan stuff you avoid, and the holy stuff of God that belongs only to the Lord, as a reminder that we belong to him. Pretty simple, one verse, we're done. Instead, we go on for about 17 verses. So how do we understand that today? Well, we take the pictures of the Bible because it gives us detailed examples from their culture. And we ask, okay, what are the basic principles that this is communicating? And then how do we apply those in the culture in which I am? So here's what the Bible said in their culture. Here are the principles that come from that, the eternal principles, and then here's how I apply those in my culture. So specific examples to general idea, back to specific examples. That's how we essentially interpret and apply the Bible. So we don't live like they did. We're not agrarian. We don't plant our own fields. Most of us don't. We just run out of the grocery store and buy something. None of us make our own clothes for the most part. Matter of fact, none of us do. You might sew your own clothes, but you went and bought the cloth. You didn't make the cloth on a loom yourself in all likelihood. And so we live in a different culture, but the principles here still apply. There are things that remind us God is holy and we are set apart to him. We don't observe the sixth day anymore. We observe Sunday because that's the day that Jesus rose from the dead, but that is a reminder we belong to him. That's why Sunday is supposed to be different for us. We don't do our normal stuff. It is a reminder we belong to God. That's why we go to church. It's a declaration, I belong to God. That's why we worship and fellowship, because I belong to God. And so there are things that we do like that. We listen to Christian radio and just lots of different stuff that we do. That says, hey, I belong to him. We give God 10% off the top from the front. That's a declaration it belongs to him. It's called a tithe. This is what we do. But there are also things that we avoid because they're clearly pagan. We don't go to psychics. We don't follow the horoscope. We don't consult. We don't go to seances and those sort of things. There are things that we avoid. Now, there might be movies that we avoid because they are so pagan and demonic kind of thing. So what about wearing mixed garments? Well, in our culture, wearing 50% cotton or 70% cotton or whatever it is, the rest polyester, is irrelevant. We don't have specific clothing for Sundays because we don't have a high priest like that. Our high priest is Jesus, and his work is accomplished. So it's fine to wear mixed up, but there is some clothing that we don't wear because the message it communicates is not good. Matter of fact, what you wear every day, in a sense, communicates I belong to God. We are to dress with decency. And I don't give a list of what those are. I don't give a list of hem lengths and hair length. Your guy's got to have his hair an inch above his ear or whatever kind of weird stuff like that. But we do ask ourselves, in our culture, what communicates I belong to God? And what things do I avoid because they communicate this belongs to a pagan deity? So let's deal with the one particularly of tattoos, because I think it's a very good illustration of what I mean. In the United States of America right now, if you see someone with a tattoo, you don't think, oh, they got that tattoo because they're a priest or a priestess of Baal or Molech or Asherah or some pagan deity or Isis or whoever. We don't see tattoos as being a religious statement in and of themselves. I'm aware that the content of a tattoo might communicate a message, but in and of itself, a tattoo is not viewed as belonging to a pagan religion. So if a Christian gets a tattoo, no one says, oh, wow, you've done something that only pagans do. Like, it's not that way. So a Christian getting a tattoo is not a violation of this text. In America, I have been overseas to some countries where the only people with tattoos are witch doctors. In those countries, Christians are very careful not to get a tattoo because it communicates, I'm a witch doctor, to animism or ancestor worship or some kind of pagan deity or a bunch of different gods. And so a tattoo communicates something totally different. Okay? In our society, there are shirts you wear that communicate something you don't want to wear. You need to avoid them. There's some places you would go. So that the idea behind this is we live in a way that declares we recognize the holiness of God and the unholiness of some of those things. And so I hope this kind of helps you understand what's going on here and to look at your own life and ask, man, there are things that I do that non-believers would look and say, I can't believe a Christian would do that. Because that's what some pagan does. That's what, non-Christians do. And then sometimes you might ask, well, why do you do that? Or why do you not do that? You say, well, that's just a way for me to remind myself of my commitment. Why do you go to church on Sundays? Because it declares my commitment to God. That's why I go. I mean, there are other reasons we go, but number one, that declares it. And when my neighbors see me pulling out on Sunday morning, headed to church, I'm proclaiming God is important enough to me that I set aside this day for Him. So there you go. So these are pictures of some principles. So we take the principles, then ask, okay, what pictures then do we put them into our lives? So I hope this helps you some with some of these weird laws and some of these strange things that we find in other places, but primarily Leviticus 19 is where we see the most of them listed out. So God bless you. Live today for the Lord and avoid those things that are clearly and obviously pagan.